Welcome, everybody, back to the companion podcast for our book, Podcasting for Small Business, the essential blueprint to launch your podcast. I'm Ray Sidney Smith, joined with my co author and my co host for this podcast series, Steve Orr. How's it going, Steve?
Ray, always going well, always a pleasure. I should just tape that and press play whenever you ask me this question.
No, I want to make sure that each time you tell folks how wonderful you're doing. I'm actually not doing so well. I'm a little
No,
under the
not as
weather,
well.
but either way, we're doing this. I'm heavily medicated, so I'm going to take full lack of liability for anything I say in this recording today.
Why should
Uh,
it be any different?
But today we're actually going to be talking about chapter 8 in the book, really some of the background in terms of chapter 8, which is all about post production. This is going to be a discussion on what happens after you've finished recording, because recording your podcast is really, I would say, not even half the journey, right? It's a small part of the journey to getting you from the raw audio existing to basically getting it into something that becomes something that people listen to out there in the world. And so we're going to cover three areas in the podcast today. We're going to talk about post production and what it really involves, from editing to publishing. We're going to talk about why post production feels overwhelming for many of you who are just starting in podcasting. Then we're going to talk about some of the tools and workflows that we talk about in the book that help you to make this a workflow that's both repeatable and consistent and hopefully a little simpler, not less difficult, but certainly simpler, so that you can go ahead and get that done. So let's get started. Let's talk about what it really means to go from the raw audio. What do you mean by raw audio when you say raw audio, Steve, and getting that to being a podcast episode?
So to me, raw audio is very simply once you press record and once you press stop on record, the raw audio is what's in between. So very, very, very simple. The next question you asked me, I already forgot the question. So what was the next part of that question?
Oh,
We're off to
what's
a great start.
what's the final product? What's the podcast episode?
So the final product is all the editing that goes into what happens to the raw audio. You have many, many different steps to get it to that final polished piece. You want me to go through some of those steps? Is that what you're asking here?
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah,
But yeah, so no, there are several different steps that you need to take once you press record and stop record that becomes the final episode that goes out to the public.
right, and that is typically going to be an MP3 file. So it's going to be the file format of an MP3. Now, there are different formats for other files that you can produce, AAC and M4A and other kinds of files that can be produced. But generally, for the mass broad appeal of the various directories, MP3 is going to be the file format that you're going to produce it finally for. And that's not necessarily the most ideal file format, by the way, in the world, right? Honestly, I would like everything to be OGG, which is OGG format, which is the open source audio file format.
And I would like it to be WAVE.
I knew that. I knew that.
WAV. Yes, that's why I raised my hand. I
Yeah,
would like it to be
I
WAVE.
knew you were going to say that. And can you explain to people why Wave for you, Steve? I think this helps people understand kind of contextually.
I mean, to me, it has the best fidelity.
Right.
And maybe because I'm coming from that radio background and I've been so familiar with WAVE over the years that to me just is kind of second nature. But I believe it has much better fidelity. It's a much cleaner sound than you can get from an MP3.
That is correct, and so this stands for waveform audio file format, and actually a subset of Microsoft's what they call resource interchange file format, or the RIF, and this is for storing high quality digital audio. And so the waveform itself is, as Steve noted, very, very high fidelity. That also means very large file size,
Yes.
right? So if we have, say, an 80 or 90 megabyte file, right, which is about 80 or 90 minutes in, if give or take, of audio recording. In an MP3 format, you're talking about a gig to maybe 2 gigs in size for a WAV file, which is why it's not used in general for podcasting, because you need a small kind of packaged file that can be downloaded very quickly and easily. And downloading or even streaming a file in that kind of fidelity would be, one, lost in the stream, and would also just be too onerous on all of the systems to download in such large files. But I would agree with you, Steve. I think that if the world got better at infrastructure, right? If we had the biggest pipes to be able to move all of that broadband data across, Wave would be the better format for podcasts ultimately. But
But
that being the case,
and yeah, no, no, I was going to say that being the case, yes, absolutely. But I totally understand that the final file that goes out to the public that you're going to upload to your podcast hosting site, which we can talk about in a few minutes, that has to be an MP3 because it compresses, like what you were saying, it doesn't take as much up as much bandwidth as a wave file would.
right. I want to kind of take away add a few of the layers of what we're talking about here. When you say raw audio, I also want people to know that might be sound effects that you might use. It might be any other recordings that you might take outside of, say, an interview. It could be any number of things. Sometimes in narrative style podcasts, you might hear outdoor noise, or if you're recording about a story that's happening in a train station, you might hear some background noise of the trains running by. Those kinds of audio elements, and there are many different kinds of audio elements that Steve has educated me about over the course of writing this book, which I have promptly forgotten. But he can talk to you about those. I'm going to ignore all those things. But there are all of these really wonderful audio elements that could be added into the audio, and those all represent raw audio as well to me. And so those are all put into an application that allows you to layer them and sequence them in such a way that gets you to that final podcast episode. So for me, the final podcast episode is when you have sequenced all of the raw audio, cut it out, cleaned it up, and got it into this final MP3 format that you're gonna have the world listen to.
Good point. Yes, I did forget about all those other elements that do go into it. So good point. You get the gold star.
No, and when we were talking about these parts of the book, I know that I'm the more techie of the two of us, and it's something that I am very, very strongly opinionated about, which is that we control the technology that produces our podcasts as business owners, because there's lots of folks out there who are, just say, they don't have the best interests of the business owner in mind when it comes to these things. And so we're going to talk through some of these pieces to make sure that you are very well aware of the fact that you control a lot of these pieces. One, having a copy of this final MP3 file. I know that it may seem like, well, anyone can download it from the RSS feed, but there is one true original, and you want to have a copy of that one true original, because the one you download from any number of podcast directories may not be the file that you uploaded. It may be changed in subtle ways, but also in profound ways that could affect you in large part. And so, one, always have a copy of that final produced file. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have the project file, and we'll get to that in a moment. I forget where it is in our discussion for today. But when we talk about production or post production, in this case, you have basically a project file that you're using, where you are taking all of your raw audio and putting it into this application that allows you to manipulate the files, cut parts out, silence parts, make parts louder, make parts softer, that kind of thing, and sequence them. And so, sometimes called a digital audio workstation, sometimes it's called audio editing software. And Steve and I chose in the book to actually remove DAW from the language altogether and just talk about audio editing software, because it's just simpler for everybody to really understand. Do you want to explain to folks kind of what happened there and why we decided on removing DAW from this?
Boy, now I'm trying to remember why we decided to not use that term.
Yeah, so there's okay,
You
I'll
may
go back.
remember this better than I do. I know we had
Yeah.
this discussion.
So there's an ongoing controversy over what a DAW is right now, and so mostly around Audacity, the software that I typically recommend to folks because it's open source and free software. And Steve is much more inclined to use a software called Hindenburg Pro. He's just radio background, his broadcasting days, he's used to using that software. Other folks use Adobe Premiere or other kinds of software like GarageBand, those kinds of things. And so a digital audio workstation typically has like a MIDI player in it, other kinds of mixing and sound production tools built into it. And those are things that Audacity doesn't have and really is not built to do. It's just strictly an audio editing software. And so there has been this ongoing, let's say, controversy over its definition. And so we just chose to make it as simple as possible for everybody who is coming to the podcast game newly to understand that you're just looking to edit software. You're not trying to build the world, right? You're not a musician trying to manifest, a creative work of art. You are trying to edit that audio from raw to final. And so that's why we chose to just basically get rid of that term and make it easier for everybody.
I had forgotten that, Ray. Thank you. See, you asked me the question. I wasn't prepared.
It's okay. It's okay. Let's talk a little bit about where podcasters get stuck when we kind of come across the kind of all of the technical elements of being able to get a podcast from that production point. They've got the raw audio, and now they've got to get it out the door. I can probably talk for hours on end about the struggles, but what are the top line items that people struggle with?
I believe some of the biggest struggles, how do you organize your files? Not only how do you organize your files, where do you put your files? Then you have the learning curve of learning how to actually edit using an editing software. So those to me are the front lines of the biggest challenges that would-be podcasters would face before they could even move on to, choosing your podcast hosting site, choosing building your website for your podcast, and all the other stuff that comes after actually doing the editing part. I know people do, again, find challenges with the actual choosing of the software, choosing the host. What are you going to use for your podcast website? I know those are challenges as well. But to me, the biggest and the first challenge is actually learning how to figure out where to store your files, what to name them, and then the actual editing piece of it, to me, are the biggest challenges.
Yeah, and so those are all things that we try to cover pretty well in detail in the book, especially how you gather and organize your files. We have a whole section on that, and I thought it was really important for us to be able to show people a model. Now, I will note that just because we provide a model for how this should be done doesn't mean it should be the model for how you should do it. It is just a sample, and then you can modify from there. I will say, though, that this model has worked really well for me when I use it. It works really well. So, you have to be consistent about its usage, and then you will find yourself in a better place. Basically, separating your raw files from your finals. That gives you a clear distinction in terms of folder structure, and then just being able to make sure that you are naming or titling files effectively so that you can find them in the future. Many times when I'm giving talks about productivity, I'm talking about the idea that people need to do a few things when it comes to their overall organizational system. They need to file things, they need to filter things, they need to find things. So filing is the idea that you're capturing them into an organized space, right? So putting them into a place to begin with where you know that it's going to be competently held for you in the future. Second is filtering things, which is getting things out of the way, things you don't want to see, right? So immediately you can start to filter by saying, I want to go to a specific folder or a set of folders where I know something's going to be, and then ultimately doing a search using the search facility within whatever tool you're using to then go ahead and find it specifically. Finding sometimes, or searching, can literally just be scanning a directory because you know where it already is. There's only so many files. Doing a search for something where there's only 5 files in the directory is kind of foolish to have to do a search for. So filing, filtering, and finding are the three fundamental activities that everybody does when it comes to these things. And when it comes to podcasting, where you're going to be dealing with lots of files, I mean, there's going to be files, cover art, and there's going to be, raw audio, intro files and project files. There's just so many different files everywhere. You're going to have little social media files that you create. All of those things need to be organized into a place where you can feel comfortable knowing that it's all organized and it's in there. Create that infrastructure from the start, and you're going to be so much better off. So I know we spend quite a bit of detail in the book going through that, but I think that's really important. We also go through the concept of creating an episode template. This is doesn't matter what tool you're using. It's the idea that you're creating basically a template for how every episode should be structured. So this is where the intro is going to go, this is where the middle parts of the episode are going to go, this is where the closing is going to go, or the outro, and all of the various parts. So if you have perhaps some transition music or some background music that starts your episode or ends your episode, you kind of get all of that stuff into a file. It's already set there, and that acts as a template. So when you get started, you just have to put in your raw audio and start from there. Am I missing
So
anything, Steve?
no, you're covering it quite a bit, and I'm just wondering, I know you have your optimal post-production productivity method, or the OP3, as you call it.
No.
Do you want to, when you're talking about naming those files and kind of what folders to put them in, centralize where and how you're storing all these files, do you want to offer a couple of extra tips as to how you should name these? At least what works for you, that works well for you, so they're easy to find?
Yeah, so for me, I really like the idea of numbering based on episode, and really making sure that people are numbering and also giving the title within the names of your files, especially your final files. So your raw audio might be like interview with such and such and that kind of thing, all kinds of names. Those all just go into the raw file folder because we really don't care about those. But the final files, they should really be descriptive. One, I like having the episode number, and I always use a 3-digit episode number, because if you're podcast recording for say weekly for 999 episodes, you can figure out how to get the fourth episode in, fourth digit in, down the road. But if you get to 999, good on you. That's like 20 years of podcasting on a weekly basis, right? So I'm not too worried about you. The technology will change by then. But so I use a 3-digit number. I like having the 3-digit number. That way it gives me room to grow. And that way the digit places aren't changing constantly. Because if you go from 1 and then you go to 10, now all the digit numbers are changed in how it orders, right? But if you
Mhm.
start with 001 and then 010 and then 100, it's all going to flow in the same order. And so I like that. I don't, it doesn't have to be what you do, but I do like that. Second, I like the name to be descriptive, and it's typically the title of the podcast episode. So that doesn't actually get added until fairly late in the game, because you might noodle around with different working titles until you come up on one that's SEO friendly, one that's going to be, that's going to work for everybody. You might add in the interviewee's name, those kinds of things. And so I like that to actually be in the title of the episode. And then I usually like to put the word final right before MP3. So I like the word final.mp3, and that way, no matter what, I can always search for all of my final episodes across my system and see all the final episodes. So it's just kind of some of the pointers that I think are really helpful for folks to know.
Oh, and that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and
Truly.
and I also create a no music file and a music file, and that's because I don't use any music that appears on YouTube, and that's just because of the constant, DMCA takedowns. And so, while I'm not actually traditionally one who uses music in any of my podcasting, you may, and that's totally legit. I just don't use any, and I would suggest not using any music in YouTube videos, just because of DMCA takedowns. But if you have licenses to use them, feel free to do so. You are legally allowed to use the music you own and have licensed. It's just that you're going to have to consistently deal with some of the potentiality of, in essence, YouTube uses an artificial intelligence algorithm to look at music. And if it looks similar to music that's licensed by someone else, they will demonetize or even take down the video, while you have to provide proof that you have the copyright licensing to be able to do so. And that could just be disruptive for some of you who don't want to have to deal with that downtime. So my choice is just to not utilize music at all. Obviously, that's a draconian approach to it, and I think others will take some other approach where they maybe put music into the ones that go into the podcast feed, and then remove the music from YouTube, or just choose to put it onto YouTube and deal with DMCA takedowns when they happen.
I wasn't sure. So which way do we want to go next? We have
Well,
many choices in which way we want to go next.
yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the issue of um, basically pod fading here, because I think that there are many opportunities for us in the post production space to um, uh, pod fading is basically the idea that you stop podcasting for extended periods of time or not altogether, right? You basically, the podcast stops producing a podcast episode, and really without a sense of it being over, right? You just kind of like disappear. It's like ghosting on a date.
Either you're lacking passion, you don't have enough content that you can come up with, you're not publishing consistently. And then once you start not publishing consistently, you're more likely to just pod fade,
Right.
at least in my mind.
And I am the prince of pod fading. So I can tell you all the reasons why I have pod faded over the years, and hopefully you can get a sense of how to avoid those things. One is emotional commitment to some of these things can sometimes be one overwhelming to the point that even small hiccups can cause you to want to step away from the project. And there's nothing wrong with you stepping away from a podcast for a period of time so that you can recollect yourself. But for the most part, you really need to think about how you are approaching the podcast for consistency, as Steve noted, and making sure that you're looking at this from a much more balanced perspective. So I'll give you one example. I published an episode on a podcast, and it took me months. It took me absolutely months to prepare for this podcast episode. And when I was done with the podcast episode, I realized that the output of the podcast, I mean, listened to by, I don't know how many people have downloaded that podcast, thousands and thousands and thousands of times, right? And that's great. I'm wonderful. I'm glad that people are appreciating and have consumed that content. But the effort for reward for me was just not there. It felt like I had done all of this work for no reason. And what it turned out to be is that I chose to do one episode instead of 4 or 5 episodes. I would have felt so much better had I not just jammed all of this content into one episode. So really remember that for yourself, which is that when you do a lot of effort in terms of preparation for a podcast episode, don't don't make the effort not worth the reward, which means that you may want to have this be an extended series. You can do a 5 podcast series within your normal podcast show on a particular topic, and your audience is going to love it. I mean, if I had done 4 episodes and then kept podcasting with that podcast, people would have loved it. I mean, it would have been great. Except that I was just overwhelmed, and I decided to just stop altogether, and that ended the podcast. I mean, I basically was like, "This is not worth it for me. I'm not going to do this anymore," and I might start it up again in the future, but the reality is that I chose to stop because I overwhelmed my system with this onerous burden of preparation. So prepare only to the extent you need to.
Well, the preparation also goes into how do you break up that content?
Yes, yes.
Sometimes it is much better. We were talking, I guess, with Riva. We talked to Riva Lisansky, who did our forward, and we have a conversation with her and talking about, how do you keep going? How do you figure out, what content, and how to do all that to avoid kind of the pod fading? And sometimes, I guess the we were having a conversation with, what's the minimum viability of podcasting and where do you start? To me, that minimum, and I know we have different thoughts on this, but to me, that minimum is to, what you say, maybe have a 4 or 5 or 6 episode series to see if this is something that you can commit to for a longer term. test out the concept and see, once you go through that maybe 4 or 5, 6 episode series, can you do another series, or is that going to spur you to do one every week, one every 2 weeks, one every month as you begin to understand the finding of the topic and how you can use those topics to generate episodes, and whether or not that can continue for the long term?
Right. And this goes back to the creation of your editorial calendar. By
Yeah.
virtue of having that editorial calendar, you're really setting yourself up for success because you are preparing yourself for what needs to be done to be able to get those episodes out the door, and in a way that's going to be both, especially for those of us who are more creative and feel much more emotional commitment to the product than not. You really need to feel fulfilled in the work that you're doing as much as you are in the production of the operational side, right? So I feel both of those things, right? I really care about the operations. I care about the operational efficiency of the podcast on the on the same ticket. If an interview goes poorly and I don't feel like it's good, I'm just not going to publish it. I don't care who it was. It could be the Pope, and I'd be like, it just didn't hit, right? Like I just felt off on that episode. And, maybe you're not going to be able to get the Pope to interview again, but it's just not right for me to publish something that I don't feel emotionally 100% behind. And that can be difficult. And so I only say it to tell you that you're not alone. That's going to happen. You're going to have interviews that just don't hit right, and you're going to have to say to that person, you know what, we got to do this another time. Let's come back to the table, and hopefully they're willing to do so. And you've got to navigate those, both the emotions, the social conflict, all of those kinds of things to make that kind of thing happen when you are that kind of emotional being. And so just kind of keep that in mind. The other side to this, go ahead, Steve.
No, I wanted to allude to something that you mentioned, a couple of minutes ago, about worrying about sometimes the numbers, and how a podcaster could give up the podcast because they really are concerned about the numbers. And I would say, don't worry about the numbers right away. If you are putting out content that you're proud of, that you believe you can continue doing so, you have the time commitment, you have the passion for it, continue, keep going. Rome wasn't built in a day. I know I hate to use that cliche. And I know people sometimes worry about those vanity metrics and, oh my gosh, I'm not getting 5,000 listeners my first episode. I got 2. Then I got 10 on my second. You can't necessarily worry about that, because an audience can grow over time. And especially, even more important than that, if you have the right audience, 10 listeners may be better than 10,000 listeners anyway, if they convert into being a client for you.
Yeah, I want to just reiterate what Steve is saying here. This is so important for people to understand, which is that influence is far more important than vanity metrics. So if you can persuade people to do something, right? If you have one listener to a podcast and you ask them to do something and they do it and they become a new client, all you need is one listener a week, right? And you've got a new client a week, right? Like that's amazing. That would be amazing results, right? 100% influence ratio, right? Versus having 10,000 people who listen to you and having a 1% influence ratio, right? That means that you have to deal with all of the rigmarole of dealing with 10,000 opinions, 10,000 people who are writing to you and bothering you about all those kinds of things. And the idea of you even having a 1% response from 10,000 people is very limited, right? You're probably going to have more like a 0.2% response on that kind of situation. And would you rather have that than have a smaller audience where you have a much higher influence ratio? I would much rather you have a higher influence ratio with a smaller audience, which means you're producing greater value. And that means as you grow, the audience will only get more productive for the business, right? Because if you have a 50% influence ratio at 2 listeners, guess what happens when you have a 50% influence ratio at 1,000 listeners, right? Now you've got to hire new people. You got to get more product. You're going to be going gangbusters with your business, right? But if you have a 1% influence ratio at 10 listeners, right? You're going to have a real problem at a 1% ratio at 10,000 listeners, because now you have to have a bigger, you have bigger production value, bigger expectations, all of those kinds of things, much more opportunities for people to criticize you, and you're not getting the benefit, right? You're not, like, again, this is
Mm.
this is the cost reward scenario that I dealt with regard to, because I came out and I'm anti minimalism, right? And I'm probably going to get some hate for saying that here on this podcast now, but I think it's an extremist philosophy, and I kind of delved into why I thought that was the case. And a lot of people listen to the podcast, it turns out. And I got a lot of hate, a lot of email about it, and I just decided it wasn't worth it, right? And so don't do that. Don't get yourself into a position where the reward is not worth the cost of it, right? Because if I were to do this all over today, right, that was 2018. 20 Was that 2018? Yeah, 2018, right? If I did that today, it would, like, brush off my shoulder like, you know, like nothing. It would have meant nothing to me today. But it meant a lot to me back then, right? And so we need to remember that there's emotions involved, and we need to be able to meter out those emotions in ways that work for us. Okay, so enough about the ways in which you kind of get stuck. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that you're going to need a couple of fundamental components for the podcast, right? So we talked about taking raw audio to final, but you're going to need some things in order to be able to literally get your podcast out to the world. And so part of that post production and publishing of your site means that you have to have some kind of website. We talk about that on in chapter 8. You're going to have some kind of media host, and that means that you have to have a place for those podcast files to basically be syndicated, basically distributed out to the podcast directories and all the various places that they go. You cannot put an audio file on your website and just release it from there. The reason for that is that, again, we're talking about fairly dense file sizes and lots of people downloading those files, not just humans, but robots, basically software, are out there downloading that software in the background. And it'll just take up a lot of bandwidth on your website. And your website host is probably not going to like that. It's usually against the terms of service, and it will get your website taken down. So you have to remember that your website's not designed to download that amount of large video or audio from your website. So you typically need to put that onto a specific media host. And so we talk about that, and kind of the importance of that, importance of statistics, making sure you're doing that, and then making sure that you are, you know, getting your website set up such that you have basically a blog. Your podcast is basically a blog. It has an RSS feed associated with it, and that RSS feed is one that you control, right? You have to have some level of control over that RSS feed, which means that if you move from one place to another, you can redirect the people who are already subscribed, basically following that RSS feed through whatever podcast apps, and you won't lose them. Okay. And you must control that RSS feed, which is why we make such a huge point in the book about the fact that you need to control the RSS feed. You should control your website. You should control the podcast or the blog that hosts the feed, and that way you are in control. So many times I get phone calls or emails from folks, and they say, "Hey, I'd love to move my podcast. I've been working with this podcast editor, and they won't give me my podcast feed. I didn't realize that I needed to control it." And they've been, maybe the editor has been paying. They've been paying the editor. The editor has been paying for the media host all along, and they didn't realize that they needed to be paying and controlling that account. And now, guess what? It's a legal fight. It's no longer a technical matter. It's a legal fight that you have to now battle, because that person is the owner of that account. They control the audio feed. They control the RSS feed. Do not put yourself in that position. Okay. So just it's an easy way to reduce problems for the business.
And I just want to make sure, and Ray, you're the technical guy between us, make sure that in case somebody is not familiar with the term RSS, can you please define that for those who are not familiar?
Yeah, so rich site summary is the technical term for it. Some people know it as really simple syndication, is its more cheeky term in RSS 2.0. But the idea is that it's a special file type that holds together a bunch of data that is included around the blog post, right? So typically that contains the content of the blog post, but a bunch of other metadata, basically data about the core content, but it also contains what we call the media enclosure. So the RSS feed was this new kind of file 20 some odd years ago because it allowed for the download of a media file, and that media file can be audio, video, or PDF. We traditionally use it for audio, but it can be used for all three. And so an RSS feed for a podcast, in our case, an audio focused podcast, is going to have that audio feed embedded within the RSS feed, which means that I don't need to go look at your blog post every day. I can use a tool that will basically look at the blog post, and every time it has a new audio file, I will download that as the new podcast episode. And that's why we have podcatchers or podcast apps that go ahead and do that. So the RSS file is basically the key to subscribing or following a podcast and getting the new data on demand.
And I just wanted to highlight one of the things you said about the importance of creating your own website rather than relying on, let's say, the podcast host creating a website for you. And we talk about this in the book, but I want to mention a couple of things because I feel that they're incredibly important for people to think about in terms of creating their own website, which can be a page linked to your business, by the way. Not saying that you have to create this whole big website with 20 pages that's completely separate from your business, can be a page on your website. But I believe the importance here is that this helps drive listeners actually to your site, which can be ultimately good for your business. You maintain the control over your domain, which is also incredibly important. And one of the things to think about also is that if you have your own podcast website, you can have a full inventory of your episodes. Whereas if you're relying on a podcast host for the business, for the website for your business podcast, they may not necessarily have that full inventory. So
That's
think
correct.
of that in terms of creating that website for your podcast and owning that yourself.
Right. And I would even more aggressively say that you should have your podcast, if possible, if at all possible, your podcast should live on your website. It should just be another tab on your
Mhm.
website.
Yeah.
And just like you would have a blog embedded inside of your website, your podcast should really be the blog engine or the podcast that is embedded within your website. And it's very easy to do today. And it's just, it makes sense. One, you're controlling your brand, as Steve noted, not just a domain, but really all the brand
Mm.
representation around the podcast. They should be pretty similar anyway. And so the podcast should be really contained within the domain. Even if you have a separate domain for the podcast itself, you can go ahead and direct it to the website and control it all within that same space.
And
So
it's very, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it is very easy because you can get a plug-in to just plug in onto your website that will play that podcast, which actually is housed in that podcast hosting site, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
that's how it will work. That's how it can work.
Yeah, so you can use extensions or plugins within a website in order to be able to host your media files, and or display your media files that are hosted
Mm,
with the media host,
yeah.
and so there's lots of different ways in which you can do this. I think again the idea here is to have the most tightly bound connection between the podcast and the website. The goal being is that your website is where you maybe have lead magnets. It's where you have calls to action for folks to be able to move further down the funnel. It is where you want people to go to see your products and services and to get to know you and the business. So why not create the content as close as possible to that, where people are much more likely to navigate and visit other parts of the website because they're already listening to this content. And this is really consultative sales. In essence, you are educating people and helping them and guiding them through the process. And if you're doing that in the podcast, well, then the next step for them should be for them to visit the website and to learn more about the products and services that you're providing to lead them further closer to talking to you or doing whatever the next step is that they need to do in order to move closer to the sale with you. So it just makes sense.
And and getting back to the hosting site itself, we spend a lot of time in the book talking about the do's and don'ts or the suggestions for how to choose that podcast hosting site. We run down, I think, 6 or 7 or whatever. But,
Yeah.
Ray, I know you feel very strongly about this. Give me the top 3, let's say, that really you should consider when you're choosing your podcast hosting site.
Well, for the most part, it's really, really about the website blog integration, right? Their ability to basically integrate with the site that you have. I'm a big fan of WordPress and the open source WordPress CMS, the content management system. But you might have a Shopify account, or you might have another website builder that you're using. Either way, if your podcast host is not going to work with it, then that's not going to work for you, right? And then the next real major issue for most people, I'm not going to say it's for me, but it's going to be storage and pricing, right? How much it's going to cost you to basically upload and do that. So if you have a 30-minute show and that means you've got a 45 or 50 megabyte file, and you've got a 200 megabyte per month hosting plan, meaning that you can upload up to 200 megabytes per month, and you're doing a weekly episode, well, guess what? That's not going to work, right? Because you're gonna inevitably go over that amount at some point, right? Especially months that have 5 weeks, and now you're going to be capped at how much you can upload. So you're probably going to have to now go up to the next storage limit in order to be able to do that, which means higher cost, ongoing costs, that kind of thing. So just be mindful of those kinds of things with regard to it. There are lots of hosts out there, and you're just going to be that much better off having a host be one that is going to be able to support you at a price that you can afford. It's going to give you all the pieces. Like for me, I really believe in having a podcast host, really the big mainstay hosts that I typically recommend to folks. Like, it doesn't matter. But there are lots of hosts out there. I don't want to make any recommendations here, but you can always come to our resources library, and you can see our recommendations in the resources library as we come up with them, as we note about them. But really, support, training, and usability of the platform are really important. Other elements. So those are kind of the top 3 for me. That support, training, and usability means that they're doing ongoing work to basically provide you with technical support and customer support when it comes to just like, hey, why is my podcast feed not rendering in one of the podcast directories? Training, meaning having ongoing training that's going to help you understand how to use the tool, but also how to podcast better. Many of these platforms have ongoing podcast training, which is really great. Steve and I can only do so much. So
We're only
you
human, Ray.
Exactly, exactly. So, but having your podcast host there to provide you that ongoing training, that's part of the price that you're paying. So they should be giving you that level of training, not just about the tool, but about podcasting in general. They're seeing an aggregate of thousands and thousands of other podcasters, right? So they should be able to help you understand how to do better as a podcaster. And then of course, usability of the platform. If you go to your platform and every time you try to do something, it's just annoying, right? That's just not going to be fun for you, right? And so you need to have some level of understanding that this needs to be something that works for you, not against you, as you are trying to produce your podcast. And that doesn't mean just you. Like if you're, again, the hope is that you get your podcast into such a place that you're delegating this down to staff and vendors or consultants who are going to be doing some of this stuff for you. That's fine. But if it's terrible for them, believe you me, that's gonna make its way upstream to stress on your plate as well. So those are my top. We cover, the total of 6 of them in the book, but that's definitely my top ones in the book. There, we also talk about how podcast episodes should be structured in terms of an SEO optimized blog post, and I think that's really important for folks to really understand. I think the most important piece there is having a call to action, or inside of your blog post in the episode, as well as in the audio. Remember, you're listening. People are listening to you for a call to action, but they're also reading the show notes that appear in the text, and that itself is going to live on a website page on the podcast. And so you should have a call to action there as well, which can have clickable links, it can have all kinds of fun things. So we want to make sure that we're engaging people both in audio and in text to do the things we want them to do, and that may be different things, right? The person listening, you may want to do something different than the person who's reading. When they ultimately get to the text of the post, you may want them to do something different. That's a place where they can click on a link. Whereas in audio, it may be telling them, hey, check out the show notes, review the show notes, and then follow the call to action in the show notes. Not being so explicit, but you know what I mean? You can, through implicature, you can go ahead and lead people toward doing these things in the show notes where they can actually click on things. That's going to be much more useful to you than asking people to go to a link that you have to like say out loud to them in the audio. Like, when's the last time someone was like, hey, go to my website.com/5279 dash, how to do X. Like, people are not going to remember that URL. It's going to be difficult. You can use short URLs, that kind of thing, but direct them to the show notes. Tell them to click on the links in the show notes. Tell them to access resources in the show notes. That's going to be much more useful for you in terms of getting people to do what you want them to do. Use natural language as well when you're doing this stuff, especially in the podcast audio. You don't want to use terms that are going to be non-natural for them to be able to understand.
Big thing that I do with my media training clients is we talk about language and making it understandable. If you have jargon and you're so determined to use a jargon word, or you're so determined to use an acronym, at least describe what that means.
Yeah. And I would say that, this is one of the longest of the checklists that we
Oh
provide
my,
in
yes, it
in the
is.
book. This is the beginning of part 3, and we do provide a pretty long post-production checklist, but I think it's really helpful for folks to be able to do. You can access the download of this checklist in the resources library on the website. And so if you go to podcastingforsmallbusiness.com and then access the resources library, you'll be able to access the downloadable of that, and then you can modify it. Really, Steve and I want you to modify it to make it work for you. This is just a beginning point for you to get started, and from there you'll be able to then add all the steps you need to make that happen. And I know it seems weird to have 14 or 15 checklist items to get a podcast out the door, but you'll learn that mine is double that length because I've enumerated it much, much more finely in detail so that I know exactly what needs to happen to get it out the door. And that means that I don't have to stress about what needs to be done. And if I have to stop midway through and move on to a client meeting, I just like check off the box where I stopped, and then I can come back to it and continue going down the list of getting it done. And that's just really, really helpful. Our sound check also in chapter 8 is also really helpful because it like just goes through all the various high level things that need to be done to, in essence, get your podcast out the door. We didn't even talk about creation of logo and album cover art and all that
Oh
other
goodness,
kind of
no,
stuff.
but it's in the book.
But it's in there, yeah, and it's important for you all to know that's covered here as well. And Steve and I, we decided to utilize the Pastry Pals podcast, the New York City Pastry Pals podcast, as kind of the example here for it, so you could kind of see why and how they adapted their brand to the podcast, or adapted the podcast from their brand in order to be able to create something that was as close as possible to the brand as possible, and making it easy for them to produce social content from it as well. And so we show some example of social content as well there. So you can just see, like, it doesn't have to be this complicated thing, right? It just needs to be simple and elegant and an extension of the brand so that you're able to communicate out to folks quickly and easily, and as fluidly as possible, while again controlling some of these. I know it seems that I'm being nitpicky about the technical pieces, but controlling your podcast feed, that RSS feed, controlling your website, controlling your podcast, those are things that as a business you are protecting a business asset. And by doing those little things, you create a whole bunch of downstream problems. You just mitigate a whole bunch of downstream problems that can befall you. That I see people, I'm literally, I got an email last week about this, so it's not like this is not happening. And so when these problems occur, The best I can do is say lawyer up, and that's never a good thing for anyone, right? It's not good for the consultant or the vendor that you've been using. It's not good for you and the business. It halts the podcast. It creates a whole bunch of problems. This podcast is going to stop. I mean, there's nothing that's going to happen to the podcast now, right? It's going to basically go on pause until they get through this conflict and get to the other side. And maybe the business owner will get access to their podcast files if they're willing to push, and the vendor contractor doesn't basically relents and gives them access to their files. But maybe it doesn't, right? And maybe there's a protracted legal conflict for some time, and that's just not good for anybody, right? So you should be in control of these things from the get-go. That means your name on things, you're paying for things, making sure that you are in control of those pieces, so you don't have to email me, because I don't like getting your emails when they're those kinds of emails. I like
Yeah.
happy emails.
You don't like any of my emails, but that's a whole different story. So I know we have just a few minutes left, but I wanted to bring this up because I feel that this is key, and many people don't think about the soft skills that you get. I know we talked about some of the soft skills that you can get as whether when you're a host, and some of the things that you learn as a host. Some of those things that having trouble speaking, some of the things that you learn as a host, you can learn in your post-production as well.
Mm,
I believe that you become a better speaker, interviewer by listening back to and editing your recordings. I know I've listened back to some of these and I'm like, boy, as a guy who was in radio for so many years, what happened? I know we are actually, and we should admit this, we are trying something new with this. We're going live over video, but we are taking this live raw feed on video and turning it around and putting it up and uploading it as an audio file for the podcast, completely raw. So I want to make that clear. We are doing something. We're trying this a little bit differently. We espouse you really need to edit. You really need to do certain things to make it tighter, to make it a better show. We are breaking everything that we say in the book. However, I am listening to this and I'm saying, "Oh my goodness, how much better can I get? What happened? I had been on the air for over 30 years. So I forgot stuff. My cadence, my flow, a lot of that has changed because I'm not regularly on the air. If you're regularly hosting a podcast, your skills are going to get better once you start listening back and you're editing. You are going to get much better. Not only that, you're going to learn new technical skills. And I believe you're going to improve your organizational skills as well if you follow what we espouse in the book about your workflows, your templates, and the like. You're going to get better, and you're also learning those new technical skills. For all editing audio may eventually help you edit video if you decide down the road that you want a video podcast. So don't be afraid to learn all of this. Just be humble about it and know that you don't learn this overnight.
yeah, and I think that I think I still stand on my point that you should go live as you should record your podcast as though you're in front of a live audience, which means that you should be able to edit less by virtue of that. And again, yeah, there's probably parts of our recording so far that I would, if I were editing these, I would cut out. That's
Yes.
fine, like
Yeah.
whatever. But I've been listening back to our episodes as they've been going live as well, just to for quality control purposes. And to be quite honest, I think that there's a genuineness there's an authenticity to the content and to what we're discussing, and I think that is far more interesting and appealing to more people than not. And I have an email address that is unfortunately public, and so everybody has the ability to email me. All they have to do is Google my name, and they will find my email address. And so everybody feels the desire to email me. And for those of you who are listening, feel free to email me. I'm happy to get the emails. It's very lovely to hear from you all. But that means I hear opinions all the time from folks about things. And I will say that the feedback so far has been very positive. I think to this. So I think the goal for us in doing this is to just give you kind of whet your appetite as it relates to all the various aspects of the book. And a little bit of the behind the scenes, and also to give you some color as to some parts that we couldn't go into necessarily in depth, to give you some, and perhaps just context, which is just helpful as you're reading a book and you can't talk to the author. Here we are. We're here to be able to do that for you.
And
Um,
as you said, I think this chapter probably is the most in-depth we have done in the book.
Yeah, definitely so far. Yeah, I think so. This one is, and again, it leans into my core strengths, which is just the technical components of podcasting, and so I feel very strongly about you learning these tools. And even if you don't ultimately do it, it's just so helpful for you to know what's happening so that you're not taken advantage of. Because so many people are going to say, oh, you need all of these things and you need all of those things.
True.
No, you don't. You need the things that we talk about in the book. And beyond that, everything else is a bell or a whistle. And all of that frill is can be wonderful and useful and great, but it is not necessary. What we talk about in chapter 8 is what you need to get a podcast out the door. And that's it. And so the goal then is to promote, and we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 10. And so we're moving ourselves right along here, because in the next chapter we're going to be talking about really syndicating to the directories. And that's probably going to be a shorter episode, because that's not really it's not the sexiest topic. Let's just say that. But it's near and dear to my heart. But it's really not the sexiest topic. And then we'll go into chapter 10, which will be a fairly robust discussion for Steve and I, because it covers a lot of the promotional activities. And then we slide right into chapter 11, which is all about generative AI and the addition of artificial intelligence coming onto the pipeline. So, any final thoughts, Steve, before we close out?
Just remember that post-production doesn't have to be scary, confusing. Once you understand what you need to do, you can put a simple workflow in place. Ray gives that to you in the book in depth. But if you do that, it'll become more manageable. Ultimately, you will save time and your show will ultimately sound better.
Thank you, Steve. With that, we'll see you next week as we discuss our episode 9, chapter 9. We'll be talking about syndicating your episodes to the podcast directories, really understanding what syndication means. We'll kind of we'll define those terms and kind of help you get all of that done. Of course, you can find the book and all of our resources and everything else like that by going to podcastingforsmallbusiness.com. And so with that, I'm Ray Sidney Smith with Steve Orr for Podcasting for Small Business. Take care. We'll see you next time, everybody.